Hello, and welcome back to the Hat Historian. In this video, we will be talking about an iconic hat of the 18th century, the Tricorn. While firmly associated in the minds of Americans with the Revolution and subsequent War of Independence, the Tricorn appeared almost a century earlier, and for the better part of 100 years was the hat of choice for European and European-influenced men, and even some women. It was worn by all, aristocrats and royalty, workmen and bourgeois, civilian and military. This style of hat was truly universal. Now it should be noted that, originally, the hat wasn't called a tricorn. That name came about after it had passed out of style in the 19th century. Originally, it was referred to as a cocked hat, so named because the brim was cocked, or bent upwards. So first, let us examine how a tricorn is formed, and how such a hat came to be. In this costume version, cheap costume version, you can see that it is formed by taking a simple round hat and then pinning, or cocking, the brim up in 3 places to form a roughly triangular shape. Round hats like this have been popular for centuries for their simplicity and the protection from the elements that they provide. In fact, modern sun hats today are still this shape. Many men, especially soldiers, would pin up one side, as you can see in classic representation of musketeers. Beyond the rakish, roguish flair that it gave them, it also had a practical purpose. When shouldering a weapon, such as a pike or musket, the brim would get in the way and cause the hat to be potentially knocked off. Pinning the brim up would solve that problem. The same reasoning is why Australian Army slouch hats famously have a side pinned up to this day. Eventually, rather than a single side, people started pinning up 2 or 3 sides. Now there are multiple explanations as to why, with some saying that it helped soldiers in the field channel water more easily, or it allowed them to shoulder their rifles on either side rather than one, while others suspect that it allowed fashionable men to show off their new wigs, the latest style of the time. It would also grant the hat a degree of rigidity compared to the floppy, round slouch hats. Whatever the reason, it created a sharp, practical hat that could easily be tucked under the arm when not worn, as opposed to the taller or floppy-brimmed hats that came before it. It seems to have appeared in Flanders in the late 17th century, atop the heads of Spanish soldiers, and spread to France after the French soldiers adopted the style during the War of Devolution in 1667–68. Upon their return to France, they quickly spread this triangular hat up to the highest circles, and when King Louis XIV took a liking to it, its success was assured. Soon the entire court could be seen sporting tricorns, often adorned with plumes or gold braid, sometimes rakishly tilted to the side, especially amongst young men. With France being, then as it is now, a center for style and fashion, soon royalty and peasantry alike throughout Europe adopted it as their headgear of choice, and even some women began wearing a form of it, often perched precariously atop their very tall wigs. These early tricorns were often made of animal felt, and were still quite tall and large, more indeed than the one I'm wearing now, almost perfectly triangular, and could still be a little cumbersome at times. The military rapidly adopted tricorns for officers as well as soldiers, as can be seen here on the French troops at the Battle of Denain in 1712. Soldiers often wore versions whose sides were laced, allowing them to be released if needed to shade the wearer from the sun. It could even be worn backwards with the back released as a sort of visored cap. One can note, and I've seen it explained at length on Brandon F's channel, so if you want to check that out, that soldiers often wore their cocked hats, as they would have called them, differently than civilians or even officers. The latter two would wear the hat the way one would easily imagine, point forward and centered on the head. But this brings up a problem I mentioned above, as you'll see, with the musket, represented here by an umbrella, bumping into the hat, potentially knocking it off when shouldering arms or marching. The men would therefore often rotate their hat slightly so that the point was above their eye, allowing them to rest their weapon on their shoulders without issue. Another place where tricorns are firmly etched in popular conception is on the head of those scourges of the seas, pirates. The reason they're associated with piracy, indeed, outside America, that is probably the first image that comes to mind when you think of a tricorn, is simply that the golden age of piracy in the Caribbean was during the early decades of the 18th century, the time when the fashionability of the hat was at its peak. These men, when not spending their plunder on carousing and drink, would have wanted to be dressed in the most fashionable style they could. This would lead them to wear, amongst other things, tricorns. A quick note on the name. As I mentioned earlier, they weren't actually called tricorns during their time of popularity, rather being referred to as cocked hats, or simply, because they were so common, as hats. The term tricorn, from three horns, and not three corners as most people might think, referring obviously to the 3 points of the hat, came about a century after they were fashionable, during the 19th century, to differentiate them from the later bicorn hat, which was also at a time referred to as the cocked hat. Therefore, while it is the correct term for it, people in the 18th century would probably have been puzzled by you complimenting them on their tricorn. The supremacy of the tricorn as the hat of choice for well-dressed men of Europe and colonial America throughout the 18th century could hardly be challenged. One just has to look at a period piece set in this era to see that there is hardly a man who isn't wearing one at some point, and even children had their own miniature versions. But as the century wore on, things began to change. It is ironic that the period the most associated with the tricorn hat, at least here in America, is also the beginning of the end of its dominance, the American Revolution. Already, its shape was evolving. When viewed from above, early tricorns were almost perfectly triangular, with a prominent front point. That point began to shrink compared to the other two, slowly evolving into what would eventually become the bicorn. The 1780s were the period when the tricorn truly began its decline. By the next decade, a tall, somewhat cylindrical hat had begun to replace it as a formal hat for gentlemen, and military tricorns could barely be called that, with the front point being shrunk to a simple crease. By the turn of the century, it would be replaced completely, with the military wearing the bicorn for officers and the shako, a tall peaked cylinder, for the soldiers, and with civilians preferring the top hat, which we covered in another video. The tricorn had had its day. Only a few holdouts would continue to wear it in the early 19th century, such as President James Monroe, whose adherence to the old style earned him the nickname the last cocked hat. But the tricorn did not die completely. Swedish officers wore a form of the tricorn until World War I, probably the last to do so as part of their service uniform. It has endured to this day in ceremonial garb and a few uniforms, such as that of the Chelsea pensioners or the Lord Mayors of England, officials in some Commonwealth countries, and the dress of some royal courts of Europe. And a heavily modified version of it is the dress hat of the Guardia Civil of Spain. It is also worn by members of the ceremonial unit, the Old Guard of the US Army, who dress in Revolutionary-era uniforms. In a more modern iteration, a tricorn is the standard form of headdress for women in several branches of the French military, amongst others. So while the tricorn might have become far rarer than it was during its days of glory, it is far from dead. So I hope you found this interesting, and will join me again soon with another hat. Until then, I tip my hat to you.